Olá, TUTAMÉIA está ao vivo, transmitindo diretamente dos nossos estúdios domésticos, com a Eleonora, que está lá no fundão.
E o Rodolfo.
E o professor Augusto Nimtz, que você conhece de todos os trabalhos dele sobre marxismo e raça, a luta dos povos oprimidos. Mas a Eleonora que faz uma apresentação do nosso convidado como manda o figurino. Eleonora.
Dear Professor August Nimtz, I will present you in Portuguese and then I will ask you questions in English. Vou apresentar o professor August Nimtz, que está lançando no Brasil Ideologia e Violência Racial pela Autonomia Literária. A gente vai depois mostrar a capa do livro ali, o Rodolfo pode pôr. Dr. August Nimtz é uma lenda da luta contra o racismo nos Estados Unidos e no mundo. Ele nasceu em 4 de setembro de 42, em New Orleans, e é um socialista, professor de Ciência Política, Estudos Africanos e Afro-Americanos da Universidade de Minnesota. Ele é graduado em Relações Internacionais pela Purdue University, mestre em Estudos Africanos pela Howard University e doutor em Ciência Política pela Indiana University. É autor de muitas obras, como Islam and Politics in East Africa, Marx and Engels, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough, e muitos outros. Nós vamos falar aqui hoje do livro que está saindo no Brasil, Ideologia e Violência Racial, e sobre a própria trajetória do professor, que eu acho que é muito bacana da gente compreender. Professor,
yes.
How do you see, in this book, you talk about Trump. How do you see Trump today? He in the last year, he's making a threat to Brazil and all over the world. How do you see Trump today? Is he a fascist? Is not a fascist? What is your definition of Trump?
Well, first, thanks to you and Rodolfo for inviting me to be a part of this discussion and this interview, and to help promote the book that I want to also thank Comrade Mario, who made it possible for this book to appear. He discovered some of my writings years ago, and he has been tireless in translating them and making them available for the Brazilian public. Yes, the Trump phenomenon. In this visit, I've been trying to make a political intervention in my audiences here in Brazil. With the second election of Trump, I think we live in a much more dangerous world than was the case with the first edition of Trump. In 2019, I published a book which required me to look in detail at the events leading up to the First World War. That required me to look at what Comrade Lenin was doing, especially his very magisterial book, Imperialism. And the thing that strikes me today is that the world looks increasingly like the lead up, maybe a quarter century before the First World War. Economic competition, capitalist economic competition, grabbing land, grabbing resources. Lenin said, in fact, that the so-called Spanish-American War was the beginning, really, of the First World War. And we think about what happened last January with the invasion and the kidnapping of President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and the fact that now Venezuela, in many ways, has become a colony of U.S. imperialism, grabbing petroleum. All that was the reality of the world leading up to the First World War. In 1888, 1892, Frederick Engels predicted that in the next European war, 15 to 20 million people would lose their lives. And Engels was prophetic, tragically prophetic, because he did a lot of research on weapons and the lethality of weapons. And again, his prediction was that in the next European war, 15 to 20 million people would lose their lives. And in many ways, the First World War was the prelude to the Second World War. The Second World War was a continuation, and another 85 million people lost their lives in that war, both because of imperialist greed. And the thing about Trump, he's so transparent, he's so naked with his project. He's the most authentic capitalist to have ever been in the White House. No previous occupant of the White House ever been the capitalist like Trump. Herbert Hoover was a self-made millionaire. The Roosevelts actually were landed aristocrats. Jimmy Carter was a self-made millionaire peanut farmer. Trump is a second or maybe a third generation capitalist. He has held no other job other than being a boss. He's a capitalist boss. I reject the idea that he's a fascist. He's simply a boss. This is what capitalist bosses do.
What capitalist bosses do?
Yeah.
What capitalist bosses do?
Yeah, it's called the dictatorship of capital. The dictatorship of capital. This is my business. This is my corporation. I tell you what to do. He's an authoritarian. That's the inherent nature of capitalism. Again, he has held no other job other than being a boss. So he's behaving like a boss. He treats the office as if this is my own business. And I tell you what to do. I fire you, I get rid of you. He's an authoritarian. He's just a simple authoritarian. And he's very, very naked, self-interest. I got mine, you get yours. The dog eat dog values of capitalism. He's a perfect lesson for Marxist education. Yeah, he is capitalism embodied in all of its characteristics. And then this time, however, unlike 1914, this time, however, we have nuclear arms. In 1914, we did not have nuclear arms. I am convinced that the protagonists who brought about the great slaughter, the Great War of 1914, if those same individuals would have had access to nuclear arms, they would have used them. They would have used them. Man, when you go back and look at their behavior, what they were doing and so on. Yeah, I have no, remember the war officially comes to an end in 1920 at the peace treaty, so-called peace treaty. 25 years ago later, it was the first use of nuclear weapons. Only 25 years later, I'm convinced if those weapons had been available, the protagonists would have used those weapons. Also different this time is that in 1914, the main protagonists were monarchs, kings, monarchs. This time we have a capitalist. There's a capitalist who's leading the charge. Engels said in 1888, 1892, that war is inevitable as long as the capitalists are in control of the economy, making decisions. If, however, he said, if the working class, if the peasants and the workers in Russia overthrew the Tsar, that would be the way to prevent the war. In other words, war was not inevitable if the toilers, the workers and the farmers of Russia overthrew the Tsar. Unfortunately, in 1914, they were not able to do that. But in 1917, they were. And that was the beginning of the end to the Great Slaughter. Once the Bolsheviks took power, that's the beginning of the end of the First World War. I mention all of this because the lesson for me today is that, if you think about it, where are the most dangerous nuclear arms? the most dangerous nuclear arms are on U.S. soil, U.S. submarines, or maybe U.S. satellites. The most dangerous nuclear weapons in the world are on U.S. soil, submarines, or satellites. If those weapons are used, it would mean the end to our species. It poses an existential threat to humanity if those weapons are used. The only force on the planet, there's only one force on the planet that can prevent the capitalist class from using those weapons. It's not the United Nations. It's not the leaders of China. It's not the leaders of Russia. It's not the US Supreme Court, not the US Congress. It's not the BRICS. It's not the BRICS countries. The only force on the planet that can prevent those weapons from being used, to draw on that insight by Engels, is the US proletariat. That's the only force on the planet that can prevent those weapons from not being used to end humanity as we know it. And that's the lesson I bring to Brazil. That's the lesson I've been employing and speaking about in my writings and everything I do today, is to bring home the reality of the world we live in today, and therefore the need to begin preparing. Comrade Lenin in 1901, in a very, I think one of maybe his most important insight. In 1901, Comrade Lenin said that if the working class does not have a revolutionary party in place when a revolutionary moment happens, it will be too late. It will be too late to try to form one. Why? Because in a revolutionary moment, there's too much turbulence. There's too much turbulence. In other words, you have to prepare ahead of time. That explains, in my opinion, why it was the Bolsheviks who led the workers and farmers to power. No other current had that kind of foresight. I regard this moment now, and the message I bring to people here and elsewhere, I regard this as a preparatory moment. This is a moment for preparing to form a revolutionary workers' party. That's the basic message I bring to people everywhere in my writings, in my classrooms, and in this intervention that I'm honored, privileged to have been making with you. And so everything I do, everything I think about, and especially with regard to the race question. For me, the race question is important because it addresses the question, how do we unify the working class? In the United States, the race question is a big question in terms of unifying the working class. Without working class unity, we cannot talk about a revolutionary workers' party. The good news, first the good news. The working class in the United States, especially since the Great Recession of 2008, the majority of the working class, as opinion polls reveal, do not believe that their children will enjoy the same standard of living that they themselves enjoyed. That's over with. The best that capitalism has to offer the U.S. working class, that's behind us. That's behind. Which means that the working class has less illusions about capitalism, the end of the American dream. That's important to remember, that the last time the U.S. working class was in a revolutionary or near-revolutionary mode was during the Great Depression in the 1930s. In Minneapolis, in my opinion, the events in Minneapolis in 1934 was the high watermark of that radicalization, because the leadership were public known communists, small c communists, not big C communists, not the CPUSA, but the leaders of what later became the United States Socialist Workers' Party. They were public. Those were the leaders. In my opinion, that was the high watermark of the radicalization of the 1930s. Once the United States entered into the First World War, patriotism kicked in. That's what undermined the radicalization. Once Pearl Harbor happened, the ruling class was able to play the patriotic card. Secondly, coming out of the Second World War, the United States emerged as the top dog. It was the top capitalist power, which meant that there was an economic boom in the United States. And so the working class was able to experience upward mobility, unlike ever before. And those two things, the patriotism, the war spending, the boom, all of that helps to explain whatever happened to the radicalization. Where did it go? Where did that
nowhere?
Yeah. And so the changes that are taking place economically in the United States, the end of the American dream, all of that bodes well in anticipation of the future. History reveals, however, that in a deep economic crisis, the working class will be open to radical ideas, not only on the left, but the right. Not only on the left, but the right. And the history reveals that if the left does not have its act together, if it has not prepared, as Lenin accurately said, then the right will get a chance to provide an answer to the problems that the working class faced. The second most important thing about the United States working class is that it is much more racially tolerant than it's ever been. Because of the civil rights movement, the working class is much more racially tolerant. Millions and millions of white workers voted for Barack Obama. For me, that's the most important thing about his election, is the fact that millions of workers, Caucasian workers, were willing to vote for him. That was a measure that registered the kinds of changes, consciousness with regard to the race question. But because he was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party is a capitalist party, those hopes on the part of those workers, both black and white workers, those hopes were never fulfilled. And therefore, for many workers, especially a lot of Caucasian workers, if the Democrats didn't work, we'll try the Republicans. We'll try Trump. Trump's an outsider. He's not a part of the mainstream bourgeois politics. We'll try that. And that's how we learn. We learn through trial and error. And if the left answer doesn't work, we'll try the right answer. That explains, in my opinion, why Trump was elected the first time and the second time. Contrary, however, to liberal opinion, no. Trump's election did not mean the triumph of white supremacy. There are a lot of liberals who believe that, white supremacy is triumphant. No. There are two pieces of evidence, in my opinion, that refute that claim. The first is in 2020, in the summer of 2020, the George Floyd protests. Up until the George Floyd protests, anti-police brutality protests in the United States had been almost exclusively an affair of Black people and brown people. Almost exclusively. That changed with the George Floyd protests. Tens of thousands of white workers came out in the streets in protests in small cities and towns. I had the privilege of attending the very first George Floyd protest because it was in Minneapolis, where I live. And it was during the pandemic, by the way. Very, very important, because the ruling class in Minneapolis tried to discourage us from coming out, saying that, no, you cannot, it's a pandemic, you cannot come together and gather together. No. 5,000 people came out, mostly Caucasian, young people came out in that protest. Black people like myself, we were a minority in that protest. That the composition, the racial composition of that protest measures, it's an indication indeed of how the change in racial attitudes, how profound they were. And Trump himself and the Democrats and the Republicans, Trump tried to use the George Floyd protests to provoke backlash, white backlash, to do what Nixon did in 1968. Nixon was able to use the protests of 1968 to win, to be elected to office in 1968. Trump tried to do the same. It didn't work. It did not work. The second important piece of information, I think, also from Minneapolis, last January, you may have heard about the anti-ICE protests. On January 23rd, something very, very unusual happened. In sub-zero weather, I don't know if you know about the weather in Minnesota, this is sub-zero weather. Tens of thousands of people, mostly Caucasian, came out to defend their co-workers from Somalia, from other third world countries, in sub-zero weather to protest. That to me was another important indication of how much more racially tolerant the working class in the United States is. So those are two important pieces of evidence for me. The good news, the good news. The biggest problem that the United States working class faces is the same problem the working class faces everywhere, including here, in my opinion. You know better than I do, including here in Brazil. Not having its own political party. Not having its own political party, being seduced into a bourgeois party, either a social democratic bourgeois party or whatever, could be the Republicans or whatever, not having its own political, that's the biggest challenge that we face. And a part of my message, a part of my writings is to make the argument about what it means for the working class to have its own political party. My critique, some of my writings have been about, they're not in this book, but then maybe Mario will get a chance to translate them. But it's a critique of social democracy. And there are two things I argue that are very problematic about social democracy. One of them is the belief that when we vote, we're exercising power. No. When we vote, we're exercising an important democratic right to register a preference. Registering a preference should never be confused with the actual exercise of power. To exercise power means to impose your will. You think about how long does it take to vote? 1 minute? You do it as an individual alone. Nothing could be more foreign to exercising power than something that takes less than a minute and is done as an individual. I call that voting fetishism. That's the term I've used. There's another characteristic problem with social democracy that Marx and Engels refer to. The term they use, Lenin loved that term, is called parliamentary cretinism. Parliamentary cretinism is the mistaken belief that what takes place inside the parliamentary arena is the end all and the be all of politics. No, Marx and Engels, the lessons of 1848, 1849, reveal that it's what takes place outside, on the barricades, on the battlefield. That's where politics, that's where power is exercised. That's what's meaningful. And no one understood those two insights better than Lenin. Lenin's approach to the parliamentary arena. Lenin made a distinction between what he called parliamentary reformism versus parliamentary or revolutionary parliamentarism. And that's what the Bolsheviks. So I've been on a campaign. That's been my other agenda, to promote the perspective of revolutionary parliamentarism. So it's a critique. It's a critique of social democracy. The social democracy is also a failure to recognize that most important insight that Marx and Engels concluded about the Paris Commune. There's only one correction that Marx and Engels ever made to the Communist Manifesto. It was in the preface to the 1872 edition. And in that preface, Marx and Engels said there was one thing that the Paris Commune clarified, which was not clear in the manifesto. The Paris Commune clarified, made clear that the working class cannot employ the bourgeois state to bring about fundamental transformations to serve the interests of the working class. The Parisian proletariat learned that only through the creation of a new state form called the commune. It was the commune. It wasn't the bourgeois state. The bourgeois state was an obstacle. It was an obstacle for fulfilling the needs of the proletariat. And as Marx saw, they said the Paris proletariat, they discovered this on their own. There was no recipe book. There was no document. They had to discover this on their own. And that's the correction that Marx and Engels make to the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto. That is a very, very important lesson. Social Democrats disagree with that. Social Democrats believe you can make use of the bourgeois state to serve the interests of the work. Sorry. It's not true. And Lenin understood that. And that's why Lenin understood the Soviets. It was through the Soviets that the working class was able to solve its problems in Russia. Not through the Duma, not through the parliamentary form, but through the Soviets. And so that's my mission. That's the intervention I've been trying to make and to bring to politics. And I've gotten good feedback from audiences. I've raised it especially here in Brazil. For me, it's very important because you have an example of social democracy in office. You have a social democratic party that's in office. And you can let me know, you can correct me if I'm wrong about the limits of social democracy, because we've never had United States is the only advanced capitalist country where the working class has never ever had its own political party. It's one of the unusual things about the United States. And a lot of it has to do with the upward mobility. The working class, its inabilities up until now to think as workers first, the tendency to think of yourself as an individual, upward mobility. And so the absence of class consciousness historically in the United States has made it very difficult, almost impossible up until now, for the working class to have its own political party. So the United States is different in that regard. Minnesota, we did actually. Minnesota is the only state where the working class did have its own political party. And it was during this moment I was talking about in the 1930s and in the 1940s. So yeah, I'm here to learn from the Brazilian case.
So what can you tell us about the status, the state of the organization of the working class in the United States? We had, like you said, all these demonstrations after the George Floyd assassination, and after that we've been having demonstrations, students against the war in Palestine, or people against the war, and some victories of the left, or so-called in the parliamentary arena. So what's the status now?
We're still at a very elementary stage. Mm-hmm. The term we sometimes say in English, the working class is still taking baby steps to organize itself. Again, the biggest obstacle we face is the lack of a working class political party. That's down the road. That's not on the agenda. What's on the agenda right now is the resistance and the fightbacks. The unions enjoy more popularity today in the United States than ever. Oh. Because of the Great Recession, more people are open to joining unions now because of the Great Recession. the problem of wages, the problem of inflation, all of that makes now, all the polls reveal, people are open to trade unions. But as you know, as Marx and Engels taught us, there's a difference between trade union consciousness and political consciousness. Yeah. We haven't gotten yet to the political consciousness yet, but the prelude, it's going through the fights, it's going through this trade union fight, the fights in the workplace, that helps to educate workers. The realization that the working class does not have a government that serves the interests of the working class. That's part of the educational process. We can only get to that stage of awareness about the government is going through the fights, being frustrated, learning about, well, whose government is this? Whose interests are being served by this? That's the educational process. And history has revealed that that process can be very rapid, the process of learning. Once we go into motion and start fighting. And so yeah, the most optimistic thing, the best thing we can say at this moment is that more and more workers are willing to fight. And it's only through that's how we all learn. We learn through the fights. There's no shortcut. There are no shortcuts to political clarity. And the more fights we do, the more we are likely to learn. So that's the stage we're at. That's the most accurate thing I think I can say. The Palestinian demonstrations were confined to the campuses. That was more of a university campus thing. We can count the number of protests that took place on campuses, maybe about maybe a couple of hundred campuses and so on, whereas there are 4,000 different campuses in the United States, 4,000 different ones. And the pro-Palestinian demonstrations were confined to maybe about 100 or so. So we don't want to overstate the significance of those protests. More important is the fact now you've got workers beginning to stand up, trying to use their unions. They realize that part of the educational process to realize that your union is not with your union. You realize that your union is weak. You got a problem. You got a problem with the leadership. But it's only through trial and error. That's how we all learn. We have to fight in order to be able to learn. So that's the most accurate thing I think I can say about what's going on in the United States with regard to the working class. And again, I can't emphasize enough that most workers do not think that their children will enjoy the same standard of living that they enjoy. Also, too, the working class is very anti-war. There's a lot of anti-war sentiment in the working class. Remember, Trump ran on the platform. He said, "Never-ending wars." Yeah, that was the claim he was making. And because Trump was an outsider, he could get away with that claim. And because Democrats and Republicans had always supported wars. And so the working class is beginning to realize, no, Trump lied to them. And so there's political clarity and clarification that's going on amongst the Trump supporters. And the biggest problem that Trump faces, the only way in which the ruling class can really win in the war in Iran is by committing U.S. troops to send U.S. troops in. And right now, politically, he can't do that. Because of the anti-war sentiment in the United States. He's unable to send in troops. And I don't think he can win. They can win unless they send U.S. troops. It's a political problem for him because of the anti-war sentiment that now exists. Where did that anti-war sentiment come from? Well, it goes way back to Vietnam, because it's the working class that always loses in these wars. And over time, the working class begins to realize, well, we've been used. They use us. And that's slowly beginning to dawn. And that's why Trump was able to use that kind of anti-war sentiment to get elected. But now the working class, those people who voted for him said, oh, what is this? What is this? And so, yes, that's another important component about the working class where it is today. Yeah.
And what about the relations of the Trump government to the world? The same thing that he does inside in the States, trying to impose his will, he tries to do in the world. And there are voices
Mm-hmm.
that are raising against that. Like Brazilian President Lula says, he's not the emperor of the world.
Right.
So, do you think that the empire, the United States empire, is being challenged today by all that's happening in the world, the wars, the whole situation in the world now?
Yes and no. The as I said earlier, we have to face up to the fact there is no power on the planet that can prevent the U.S. ruling class from using those nuclear weapons other than the U.S. proletariat.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the United Nations. It's not Putin. It's not the leaders in China. It's not the BRICS country. All of the U.S. working class can prevent those weapons from you. The United States is now the top dog. It's clear that there is no capitalist power other than the United States. None. There's no power that can challenge the United States. Again, the only force that can prevent those weapons from being used is the U.S. proletariat. The resistance that's taking place within parts of the world, on the part of the oppressed, that's important. It's very important, but it's not. We have to be very honest. That resistance is not able to prevent the United States. Look at what's happening. Your flag, your Cuban flag there. It brings to mind the reality of Cuba. My weekly political work, if you're wondering what do I do politically here, Cuba solidarity work. I've been doing that for at least 4 decades. And we have to face the fact that at this moment, the United States has a knife at the throat of the Cuban Revolution. It may accomplish this time what it's been trying to do for 6 to 7 years. For 6 to 7 years, the Cuban people have been able to maintain a working class government and state in power. But at this moment, things are very, very uncertain. We don't know. No one can predict the outcome of this. I sometimes say it's amazing what the Cubans have been able to do. If you think about it, for 6 to 7 years, 90 miles away from the most powerful country in the world, they've been able to get away with it. And the one thing I tell people today is the one thing we can be sure of, we don't know what's going to happen right now. The one thing we can be sure of is that imperialism cannot erase the lessons of those 6 to 7 years. And those 6 to 7 years will be important in the making of the second socialist revolution in the Americas. We will need to know those lessons. We will need to know the mistakes, what the Cubans got right, what they didn't get right. Remember, the first time the working class took political power was in Paris, the Commune. It lasted only 2 months. And boy, Lenin tried to get every bit of information about the Paris Commune to help him think about a revolution in Russia. The second time the working class took political power was in Russia. It's my opinion that the working class was in political power in Russia, I think, for about maybe a decade before there was a counter-revolution in which a bureaucratic caste replaced the working class in power. But those 10 years are extremely, extremely important and so on. But now in the case of Cuba, we got 6 to 7 years. 6 to 7 years of the working class in power. Extremely, extremely important lessons. So the fight now, in many ways for us, is to tell the truth about the Cuban Revolution, what the Cuban Revolution was able to accomplish. One of the things I've discovered in this visit is the uncertainty among some people about whether or not is Marxism relevant for the Black struggle in dealing with the race question. That's come up in some of the discussions I've had with people. And my answer is two things. I've co-authored a book looking at how Marx and Engels responded to the U.S. Civil War, comparing Marx and Engels on one side to Frederick Douglass on the other. And that investigation, that research reveals that Marx and Engels had exemplary credentials. They did all they could to aid and abet the overthrow of slavery. And one of the reasons Marx never finished writing Capital, because Marx began to devote all of his attention to developments that were going on inside the United States. All right, so fast forward to 20th century, to the question, or is Marxism relevant to the Black struggle? Fast forward to the 20th century, Cuba. The contribution of Cuba to the African liberation movement. After Mandela came out of prison, Mandela made 2 visits. The first visit was to the United States to thank the anti-apartheid movement for what it did. And the second visit, right after the United States, Cuba. He went to Cuba, and in a speech to 300,000 Cubans, Mandela said, were it not for what you did, the Cubans, did in Angola in 1988, the defeat of the South African army, he said, I would not be able to be here today speaking to you. So whenever I hear this question about, is Marxism relevant to the African liberation movement, Cuba, we have the example of Cuba before us. The Ebola crisis in 2014, the World Health Organization went to Cuba and said, look, we know about the history of your medical brigades. Can you help us? Can you send Cubans to help deal with the Ebola outbreak? And the Cubans did. The only government, no other government anywhere in the world sent personnel. There were private organizations like Doctors Without Borders and so on. But in terms of their own government, no other African government, no other government in the Caribbean sent their medical personnel to Africa to deal with the Ebola outbreak and so on. So yeah, we should have no uncertainty. We should be very confident when we answer that question. When people raise the question about Marxism and the Black struggle, Marxism, the example of the Cuban Revolution. And this is what Washington hates. This is what Washington wants to get rid of. That's the threat. When Washington says that Cuba is a threat to the United States, they're not talking about some military threat. It's a political threat. It's the example of Cuba. It's the example of Cuba that Washington fears the most. And so they've been wanting to get rid of it for 6 or 7 years. This time they might be successful. We don't know. We can't predict that.
Professor, since the election of Mandami in New York, we are hearing the word socialism in the newspapers, in campaigns. Some say that the idea of socialism is growing in a way in the United States. Is that true?
Right.
It's a good sign.
Yes.
What do you think?
You're right. And there's a lot of discussion because there's an organization called Democratic Socialists of America. And they've been winning a number of elections and so on, especially in New York. A lot of young people have been voting for it and so on. And the ruling class, the Democratic Party officials, the official Democratic Party is very nervous about that fact. Opinion polls reveal, especially amongst young people, people have very favorable attitudes about socialism. I leave aside, as you all know, there's socialism and then there's socialism. Depends on what people mean by it. But the fact is, yes, I grew up during the
word itself has been demonized.
Exactly. But for young people, that's not a problem.
It's a good
Not a problem. For my generation, I grew up under the McCarthy, during the McCarthy period. I can tell you what it was like during that period. But for young people, they're not afraid of. And for the ruling class, that's a problem. That's a problem with the young people. The problem with the Democratic Socialists of America, this particular party, it's a social democratic party. They operate inside the Democratic Party. Their strategy is, their goal is to push the Democratic Party to the left. Police. The Communist Party of the United States has been trying to do that since 1935 with the Popular Front. The policy that came out of Moscow, known as the Dimitrov's policy, the Popular Front. That's what the Communist Party has been trying to do. And what has the Communist Party been able to do with the Democratic Party? No. Democratic Party is still the capitalist party. It's done. So this new strategy on the part of the Democratic Socialists of America is a continuation. It's a policy, in my opinion, it's a miseducation. It's miseducation. We have to be very, very honest about that. And so that's what my project has been about. My next book project, in fact, is a book that will bring together the writings of Engels, Frederick Engels, his last writings. And in his last writings, he did two things, two important things. One, it was a critique of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. As the Social Democratic Party in Germany began to move more and more to the right. Engels is critique. He's going up against people like Bernstein and Kautsky, especially Bernstein. His critique of the direction, the reformist direction of the German Social Democratic Party. And the second group of writings was his anti-war, anti-militarization writings. He anticipates that a war is coming. He wants to prepare revolutionaries in Europe for that eventuality. How do we prevent war from happening? So that's my next writing project, is to bring together Engels's final writings against reformism and against militarism. And I think it's needed at this time because, again, there are a lot of young people who think that socialism means to operate inside the Democratic Party. That's a problem. That's a problem. So
I'd like to go back to your personal experience, and especially in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Since what happened in January, how are things now? The organization grew, or it's just lost. Any political conscience grew. So what's the situation in Minneapolis? What can you learn, or can the political groups learn from what happened there?
Right. Yeah, at this moment, the La Migra, the ICE, the Trump administration was forced to withdraw some of the ICE personnel from Minnesota. And so the number of people who are being arrested and deported, that's diminished. But in other parts of the country, it's still happening. And so one thing we have to be careful of, as I sometimes say about Minnesota, is beware, be careful of socialism in one state. We cannot, things are very, we've made progress in Minnesota, but Minnesota is a part of the United States. Minnesota is a part of the world. And sometimes people in Minnesota, we start patting ourselves on the back of how great we are, and so on. That's a problem. That's a problem. One of the useful things, the most positive thing about the demonstrations in January is that the unions began to provide leadership. Very important. The unions began to provide, because the question of migration, the question of migration, as it is anywhere in the world, it's a working class question. And the unions have to take up this question. And so unlike the George Floyd protests, unfortunately, those protests deteriorated because they became a lot of ultra leftists, a lot of anarchist forces burning down the police stations and so on. All that did was to give the ruling class an excuse to send in the troops. That was a problem. With the ICE demonstrations, however, the union stepped forward and provided some leadership. And that becomes a model that we can emulate for other cities. And so, that was the most positive thing about Minneapolis. To your question, I think, has that been generalized to others? Not yet.
Mm-hmm.
Not yet. And we have to be honest about that fact. Related to this question, I think, is the issue of fascism, why I think we're not facing a fascist moment. My reading of the history of fascism, and I find the writings of Leon Trotsky the most persuasive, because Trotsky lived through, he saw this, he saw the fascist movement. He issued the first warnings about fascism. Fascism appears when the union movement begins to become a threat to the interests of the ruling class. When the ruling class begins to fear the unions, the fascists are brought out to break the unions. That's the history of the fascist movement in Europe. Right now in the United States, the unions are not a threat. They're not a threat to the ruling class. So therefore, the ruling class says it has no need to bring out the fact. There will be a time in the future. In the future, there will be a time when the ruling class will play the fascist option, but not now. Because if they do that now, all it does, it will radicalize the movement by getting rid of, by eliminating civil liberties and democratic rights, by bringing up, no, all that does, that will radicalize people. So the ruling class is smart enough to know, not now. Not now. Only when the unions have become a threat to their interest. That's when you call up the fascists. That's what happened. That's what happened in especially in Germany, and also to some degree in Italy. That's not on the agenda. That's not on the agenda right now.
But on a way, the ruling class isn't always trying to find or to tell the society that there is a big enemy that we have to fight against, and sometimes it's the workers or the unions.
Right.
Now, wouldn't that be the immigration problem?
Yes.
I mean, there is like a ghost.
I agree. But that's why Minneapolis is so important. Exactly. The Trump administration tried to use the immigration question to justify the use of the police.
Mm-hmm.
But people in Minnesota stood up. They resisted. Tens of thousands of people in Minnesota came out in the street to resist exactly what the Trump administration was doing. That's what I'm trying to, you're absolutely right. They're always looking for opportunities. And when they did so in Minnesota, they overplayed their hand. And people in Minnesota came out and said, no, we don't want this. And so the Trump administration was forced to pull back, go to other cities, but not in Minnesota. But you're right. I was just reading today's news. I don't know if you heard what happened in Ceuta. Trump is trying to use that.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying if the Republicans do not get elected in November, this is what will happen in the United States. He's already trying to use that. And I'm saying, based on the Minnesota experience, I think millions of workers will not buy into, they will not be seduced. They will not be seduced by that appeal. But you're absolutely right. They're always looking for opportunities to corrupt, to undermine working class solidarity. And right now, we have examples of working class solidarity, people standing up to those kinds of appeals. And that's what I'm saying. That's different today. That's different today in the United States. So we have opportunities, in other words, because of the history of progressive movements in the United States and so on. We have opportunities today to bring together, unify the working class. And so I'm always looking for ways to unify the working class. Some people are always looking for what distinguishes us. What are the differences within it? I'm interested in how we bring the working class together. And I'm saying that we have opportunities today that, boy, I'm old enough to remember the divisions within the working class. Oh, no. The trade union. Both of my parents were presidents of their unions, both of my parents, but they were segregated unions. They were segregated. How can you have a
union?
Yeah, with a segregated unions? Today, the unions are much more integrated than they've ever been.
Oh, yeah.
Than they've ever been. That's a big deal. Very, very.
Because racism is always a tool to divide.
Exactly, exactly. And some people on the left, in my opinion, they buy into that. There are some people on the left who are into what distinguishes us, what separates us.
Mhm.
I'm looking always for. So the book, my most recent book is called, not the one that's,
Mhm.
not this, but another
Mhm.
one called Black Marxism,
Mhm.
a Marxist critique. There's a very influential book written in 1983 by a Black scholar who claims that Marxism has nothing to teach with regard to the Black struggle. Marxism is irrelevant. Yes,
Wow.
this is the book.
Mm.
Yes, and the Black Marxism, a Marxist
Mhm.
critique.
Mhm.
And so this book, I understand, has some appeal here in Brazil. There are some people who think that this is about Marxism, and I'm here to say no, it has nothing to do with Marxism. It's an opponent. He's an opponent of Marxism, and so that's the other part of my appeal and my intervention. And this is a book published a couple of years ago with my co-author, and this is a book that compares Marx and Engels on one side and Frederick Douglass on the other side during the U.S. Civil War.
Mhm.
And this is the book that provides evidence about Marx's revolutionary credentials when it came to the Black struggle, when it came to the overthrow of slavery. This is Marx at his best when it comes to understanding the race question during the U.S. Civil War, when that was the question. How do you overthrow the institution of chattel slavery? Marx was there. He did all he could to advance that fight, including one of the reasons that Marx never completed Capital. As you know, Engels had to finish the last 2 volumes. Marx never completed it because he was giving his attention to developments in the United States. He was doing all he could to help advance the fight to overthrow the slave owners. So yeah, that's a part of my intervention and what I'm doing and trying to bring to audiences here in Brazil. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Comrade Mario for inviting me to be a part of this intervention. And it's a privilege on my part, and it's a real honor on my part to do this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Let's get.
All right.
All gonna speak in Portuguese. Que a gente quer. We'd like to thank you very much for your time here with us, bringing so much fresh ideas to the debate in Brazil. And we'd like
Because
to.
we share the history of slavery, Brazil and United States.
Yes.
Big countries with this past.
Of course.
Yeah.
We have so much to understand each other.
During the U.S. Civil War between 1861 and 1865, the slave owners in Brazil, they wanted to know what was happening. Every day the slave owners would wait for the ships from the United States to bring newspapers from the United States to hear what was happening in the United States, because every slave owner in Brazil knew the outcome of the war in the United States would determine what happened.
Yes.
The same that had happened before with the revolution in Haiti.
Of course, exactly.
So,
Inspired me.
Yes.
bom, e a gente aproveita para agradecer também a todo mundo que está aqui acompanhando ao vivo, a todos que nos visitem a qualquer momento pela internet.
Agradecer a Autonomia Literária.
Isso. Pelo livro, deixa eu mostrar de novo a capa aqui.
Está aqui.
O organizador está aqui também com a gente.
Mostra aí.
Aparece aqui, Mário.
Vem aqui, Mário. Aqui atrás, aqui, né?
Isso.
Parecia joia.
A gente lembra a você para se inscrever no nosso canal, clicar na sinetinha para receber avisos de novos vídeos e também participar do grupo Amigos do TUTAMÉIA. O link de convite para participar desse grupo está disponível na descrição desse vídeo. E agora, antes das despedidas, a gente volta a palavra para o nosso convidado para que, então, please send your message to the people that are live with us now, people that visit us at any moment to the internet. The word's yours.
Again, thanks to both Eleonora and Rodolfo for inviting me to be here to carry out my intervention.
Oh, okay.
Carry out my intervention and to learn from you,
Oh.
to bring back the lessons to the United States, the reality of social democracy in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Pessoal.
Tchau.